Hello, everyone. My name's Tony Broh, and I'm the Vice President for Shulak-Rome at Congregation Dorshite Tzedek, and I'd like to welcome you here to this meeting, which is taking place actually on the 54th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. So today is anniversary of that, and of course, April is Fair Housing Month as well. I'd like to point out that an event like this takes a lot of planning, and there was a planning committee that I'd like to thank. And Melissa, if you would show that next slide, then I would like to thank them especially for all the help they provided with communications and planning and getting speakers together. This evening actually began as a hallway conversation, I've got to say, when a member of our congregation stopped by my home and was actually running an errand, and in the hallway just happened to say, you know, there's this documentary called Segregated by Design that we would love to show to the congregation. And in that context, I said, well, that's a great idea. So let me introduce Louise Keshet, who was the person who had the idea for this evening and who started that hallway conversation. Lisa?
Don't move it. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Tony, for that warm welcome. And thank you again to all of our planners and our speakers and to our CDT staff. And also thank you for our guests, many of whom are from diverse communities who've come together as justice seekers. As we learn from the Hebrew Bible, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. Back in December, I participated in the first Newton Interfaith Housing meeting of what was to become the Newton Interfaith Housing Coalition. Together, like tonight, we watched the documentary Segregated by Design, and we decided that each of us would go back to our religious communities and screen the documentary. And so, as Tony mentioned, he and I explored the idea of a larger gathering, both of CDT members and also for the larger faith community, and so this evening's event was born. And as Tony mentioned, we chose the month of April because it's the Fair Housing Month. On April 1st, 1968, as many of you know, the Fair Housing Act was codified into federal law with the goal of eliminating racial segregation and ending housing discrimination in the U.S. I just recently learned that enforcement mechanisms weren't put into place until 1988. This landmark Civil Rights Act makes it illegal to discriminate against a person in the purchasing, the sale, the rental, or financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. And thankfully, President Biden, on the day he was sworn into office, he extended those protections by prohibiting discrimination against those based on gender identity and sexual orientation. As many of you know, the West Metro Home Coalition and analysis of impediments to fair housing further explains fair housing exists when people can find safe, suitable housing within their economic means, wherever they choose to live, and they do not face discrimination based on their membership of a protected class. The Fair Housing Act also commits recipients of federal funding, including the City of Newton, to advance fair housing in their own communities. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that CDT membership is diverse, our communities that we live in are diverse, and therefore our concern for housing equity goes beyond Newton. As we kick off this gathering, we're reminded of the awakening of the springtime and the Passover holiday of liberation that the Jewish community will celebrate this Friday night. And we'd also like to wish our friends a joyous celebration of Easter, Ramadan, and Vesaki. Just quickly, we've carved out some time for discussion after Henry Corman's presentation on the regional impact of discriminatory housing policy. And we'll be taking questions from the podium and via Zoom. Feel free, Zoom participants, to put your questions or comments into the chat, or you can ask questions live. We also will break up into some small groups towards the end of the program to give participants a chance to meet each other and maybe share some ideas about further action. So without further ado, Segregated by Design was created in 2019. It was written and narrated by Richard Rothstein and directed, designed, and animated by Mark Lopez. It chronicles the historic use of law and policy to segregate housing by federal, state, and local authorities.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African-American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African-American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African-American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes, but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment, that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Hi, I'm Jeff Sachs. I'm a member of CDT. This is a very powerful insight into an important part of our country's history. Before we turn to a discussion of the implications for what we should be doing today, we'll be hearing from Henry Corman, who has a long legal career in private practice as an affordable and fair housing expert, and is now general counsel at the senior housing developer and operator True Life Communities, where I sit on the board. Henry is going to tell the story of the effects of these laws on Boston and Newton. True Life Communities, which was formerly known as Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, was founded over 50 years ago, as many of these policies were having significant impacts in Dorchester and Roxbury. Jews and Blacks had shared those communities until the late 60s, when these government and bank-led blockbusting policies resulted in panic selling, leaving elderly Jews behind in those neighborhoods. True Life Communities originally sought to help address the needs of those families. Henry will bring the story of this housing segregation very close to home for all of us.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here tonight. Melissa, I don't know where you are, but if you could PowerPoint up, I think the first slide could you go to the next slide, please? There we go. Okay, so my job tonight is to talk at the regional level and to try to illuminate for you in the Boston region some of the themes that Richard talked about in Segregation by Design. And Kathleen Hobson, an old friend, is going to talk more about Newton specifically. So could you just show the next slide, please? Melissa? Oh, it's not here, it's up there. So this slide Richard's, the book Color of Law and the film talks about segregation. I want to start by telling you what segregation looks like in our region. This just tells you the racial composition of the roughly 164 communities that make up the Boston metropolitan area. And as you can see, about 2/3 of the region is comprised of white people, and the rest of the region is comprised of Asians, people of Latin origin, and African Americans. Next slide, please. Whoop. There we go. So this is, if you were to map where people live, though, you see a very different picture. And I pulled these from the Census Bureau's website. This is a 2020 census. What you see in the purple is where white people live. So they live pretty much throughout the region, except in certain areas that you see in yellow. On the top, on the right-hand side, or at least my right-hand side, what you see there is where African Americans, where black people live. They only live in a few places in this entire region. On the lower left-hand side, what you see is where Latin people live, again, concentrated in very particular areas. And finally, Asian people live in a much more dispersed kind of environment. Next slide, please. What the map doesn't really show you is really how concentrated people are. This table that I'm showing you, what it really shows you is that 2/3 of all people of color live in just 9 communities in this 154 community region, right? So 2/3 of all black people live in those 9 communities, right? So what we look like in this region is we're very separated. Can we see the next slide, please? And just to put a finer point on it, if you sort of think back to the mapping slide that I showed you, where what you see is this sort of vast area where white people live, and then these pockets where people of color live. If you dig down into the data, into the social science that measures what segregation is, probably the most profound set of numbers is the ones that show the degree to which white people keep themselves separate from people of color. And that's what this slide is intended to show you, right? And so in part, I think what goes on when we're considering the segregated landscape in which we live is not so much what we see, it's what we don't see. It's who we don't see, and it's the conditions in the built environment that we don't see. And so what I'm going to now show you is a little bit more about that. Could I have the next slide, please? So what the segregation leads to, Richard in his film talked about the disparities in wealth. This is from a study by the Boston Federal Reserve showing you what wealth looks like based on race. And what this tells you is that your average white family has about $250,000 in assets, and your average black family has $8 in assets. So you can see that the effect of segregation on people in terms of their ability to accumulate wealth, to pass it on to their children, is really profound. The disparities are glaring and really profound. And what the Fed determined in looking at this, when they did this study, was that this is mainly the intergenerational transfer of wealth, and it's mainly through the value accumulated in a person's home. And so housing and home ownership really is both a tool for mobility if you can get to it, and it's a barrier to opportunity if you can't get to it. Next slide, please. So how did we get like this? Well, so, you know, part of what I said I would try to do is show you how some of the themes in Segregated by Design you know, flow through to the Boston area. This is a deed from Fairhaven, which is on the South Shore. You can see circled in red there, that's a racial covenant. The land shall not be sold, leased, or rented to anybody except a member of the Caucasian race. And so this is, you know, so the same tools that Richard's talking about that were private mechanisms of excluding people from home ownership based on race exist here. Next slide, please. So this is one of the redlining maps from the Boston area. And the area that is circled in the red circle is Roxbury, parts of Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, and Mattapan. The red areas are primarily where black people lived, and the yellow areas were primarily where Jewish people lived at the time this map was put together in roughly 1938. What's really telling about these redlining maps is the degree to which government really worked hard to try to quantify, if you will, the degree to which people who were disfavored because of their race or their religion were to be impacted by federal lending policies. And this was done through appraisals. If we could have the next slide, please. So this slide shows you one of the, just a snippet from one of the appraisals for one of the geographic areas. This one happens to be from one of the yellow areas. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but if you see in the red circle, that area was marked down and excluded from FHA. Well, actually, this is from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but excluded from loans because of infiltration of Jews. Next slide, please. This is an appraisal collecting data on one of the red areas in the map. And this tells you that there's infiltration of both foreign people and Negroes, and it describes in quite graphic detail that this is a red area because Jews and blacks live there. So that's the kind of really quite explicit racial thinking that went into the redlining practices that emerged with the sponsorship of government beginning in the 1930s and not really ending until the early 1970s. It says, the bottom part says in the clarifying remarks, Negro heavily concentrated north of Ruggles Street on the west side of Washington. We know these neighborhoods, right? Jewish clustered around Columbus Square, a large territory with some streets showing better experiences than the balance of the section. So Jews, blacks, and there's a few pockets of maybe worthy places. So next slide, please.
What is the year on the document?
That would have been 1936. So this is, Richard talked also in his film about the FHA lending manuals. This is just a section from it which talks about not making loans in places where inharmonious racial groups are coming together. Again, it's not just about picking out places that are populated by blacks or by Jews or by other disfavored groups. It's also about keeping them apart. Next slide, please. So Richard talked about blockbusting, and so I want to highlight for you a practice, a set of events that took place in Roxbury that really had a profound impact on the neighborhood and also ties into what Jeff was talking about, right? So the Fair Housing Act gets passed in 1968. By then, the government itself is under enormous pressure to stop its really racialized practices of lending or not lending to blacks or not insuring loans by banks to blacks and other disfavored people like Jews. And so the city of Boston and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development got together with what was then called the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and a group of about 15 local banks to create a program called the Boston Bank Urban Renewal Group. And what they did was they drew a line around an area in Roxbury, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, and parts of Dorchester. And they said, we will make loans to black people inside the line. Now, there were 3 FHA loan products available at the time, and the only loans that were being made within the line were the most expensive ones, the ones that required the largest down payments, had the highest interest rates. And what ensued was a period of blockbusting. In other words, real estate interests and appraisers who were associated with the program and associated with the banks and worked for HUD and worked for the city went door to door to the white Jews, and they said, the black people are coming. And it just instilled racial fear, resulting in the sale of homes at pretty discounted rates to real estate interests who turned around, marked them up to the maximum amount available under the FHA insurance program. Often these were homes with serious disrepair that was literally hidden from the buyers, turned around, sold them to black people, and in the end, the program was marked was characterized by really high incidence of foreclosure and loss of housing to people, and really extraction of value from Roxbury. And so this is when Jeff was talking about Jewish community housing for the elderly, now Two Life Communities kind of getting its start around this period of time. It's because at this point, the white Jews who lived in the neighborhood became more favored, and they got the benefit of the better mortgage, FHA mortgage insurance products. They moved to places like Newton and Brookline and other communities in the suburbs. And that left a lot of elderly poor Jews and JCHE was created, or Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly was created to provide affordable rental housing to that group of people. Now, I want to just show you, if we could have the next slide, please. This is how the Beberg line maps over the redlining maps. So you can really see that there's a straight line over nearly a 40-year period of identifying areas by race, and then a really targeted program of disinvestment and equity stripping. And if we were to flash forward to 1992 and 2008, both periods of time of very high levels of predatory lending and very high levels of foreclosure, much of it was visited in this area as well. Can we have the next slide, please? So another theme that Richard talks about in Segregated by Design is this concept of urban renewal. This is a map of Boston's urban renewal areas, and they also map onto these same areas of redlining, of racially identified areas that were excluded from investment. Next slide, please. And you can see that this is a map that is from the Boston Redevelopment Authority, considering the racial consequences of urban renewal in the south end of Boston and other parts of Boston. And what this shows you is where black people are moving, right? They're moving into this concentrated area in Roxbury, and this is taking place at the same time as redlining was taking place, and taking place at the same time as the Beberg program was getting rolled out. So it was, to me, I'm a lawyer, right? I think about evidence. To me, this is like evidence, right? This is evidence that race was first and foremost, even at this period in history during urban renewal. Can we have the next slide, please? So one of the consequences of these practices was the creation of what some scholars call the dual housing market. There was a market for white people comprised of home ownership, largely subsidized through low interest loans, low down payment loans, and mortgage insurance sponsored by the federal government, and a separate housing program, if you will, for people of color, and that was low rent rental housing. And so this map just sort of shows you the location of where all that low rent housing went as a consequence of urban renewal. And it goes into the same neighborhoods that you saw that marked in red. It goes into Roxbury. And in fact, if you were to take a map out of the city of Boston, what you would see is that most affordable housing is located in places like Roxbury, parts of Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, which at the time these places were constructed were populated predominantly by people of color. And in fact, if you were to take out a map of Massachusetts, you would see exactly the same thing. Have the next slide, please. So Richard referenced this idea of highways, and here's where I think it's useful to think about what you don't see as opposed to what you do see. So there was an entire African-American neighborhood in Boston called the New York Streets neighborhood, which was completely obliterated as part of as the first urban renewal program in the city of Boston in 1955, and it was done in part to put in I-93. So when you take I-93 and you go south and you kind of look over to your right, and what you see is the Pine Street Inn and what is now called SoWa, I think, south of Washington, very kind of trendy district. That used to be a black neighborhood, right? That used where people actually lived, and it was utterly demolished and zoned really for retail and commercial use, which never took off, and so now it's become kind of a trendy, gentrified place. But what this shows you is another highway that was planned but never built, the Southwest Expressway. This was a highway that was going to go right through Roxbury and parts of Dorchester and Jamaica Plain, kind of to the west of Franklin Park. And so just to give you a flavor for what this planned highway did, I'd like to just go to the next slide if we could. So what you see here is Melrose Boulevard. What you see here is what the neighborhood looked like before the state came in and condemned all the housing, drove all the people out, and demolished all the dwellings. That's what the top picture shows you where people lived. The bottom picture shows you what happened when the highway was in its planning phase. There's a whole story to be told about a civil rights movement that grew up to try to stop the highway, not soon enough to keep this from happening. This is the area of Mass and Cass now, right? And if you go through this neighborhood now, areas that look like this include where the orange line goes on Columbus Avenue. And I've spent a good piece of my career doing affordable housing and community development work, and I can tell you that we, as an attorney working on those kinds of projects, we're still trying to correct the loss of housing and the loss of prosperity that was associated with the development of the highway. And I'm overstaying my welcome, I think. The next slide, please. This stuff was not really limited to Boston. This is the West Newton Interchange. Kathleen's going to talk about this a little bit more. This was Newton's black neighborhood around the Myrtle Baptist Church, and the same kind of thing happened there. The next slide, please. So I want to talk really quickly about zoning, and because zoning is a tool, is another barrier that is erected to keep people separate. And I'm just going to try to whiz through these quickly. So this map shows you where you can build more dense multifamily housing. It maps into that same area where mainly people of color live and where mainly white people don't live. Next slide, please. So I just want to, these next few slides just take you through some history of zoning. Zoning is authorized by the Massachusetts Constitution. Issues of race were first and foremost during the debates of the 1917 Constitutional Convention, when there was conversation about whether zoning would be used as a tool of racial exclusion. Next slide, please. Alice Ingerson has done a really marvelous presentation on this history of zoning in Newton. This is a couple of things I took from her work. It's basically an exchange in the Newton, whatever, the predecessor of the Newton tab, which is an exchange between citizens talking about whether we ought to be using zoning as it was coming into being in Newton as a result of the constitutional amendment, whether we should use it as a tool of exclusion of immigrants and others. Next slide, please. So, and this way in which zoning and racial separation is tied together just continues to resonate over the decades. In 1968, there was the Legislative Research Council associated with the state legislature, observed that school segregation and other kinds of things in part is a consequence of land use decisions. In 1975, the Massachusetts Advisory Council to the United States Commission on Civil Rights made the same observation. Next slide, please. In 2014, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did a fair housing equity analysis, looked at analyses of impediments. This is what I think you referenced earlier, Lisa. Across the entire region, virtually every single one of them says that a racial barrier, a fair housing barrier in the region is zoning and land use restrictions. And finally, just 3 years ago, the Greater Boston Housing Report Card found the same thing. So those are some of the mechanisms that work to kind of create the environment in which we live, and it's how, and it's those things that connect what exists here to the kinds of themes that you saw in Segregation by Design. So I don't know what we're doing next, but.
Yeah.
One question, we talked about when they had, it was sort of 1968 when they had made places for the blacks, and they were giving loans to the blacks, but it sounded like, and they were high income loans, or high, not high income, high expensive loans. It sounded like they would only give, still at 1968, only loans to blacks who lived in those areas. You moved towards like outside the area, you couldn't get a loan if you were black.
That's exactly right.
So, what was?
Well, and I think the point of that is just to sort of depict for you the way in which racial ghettos, racial concentration was created. And that was just one of the many tools, right? It's like you can, if we're going to make a loan to you, you can have one, but you can only live here. And by the way, it'll be a predatory loan. Are there other questions, or I've overstayed my welcome, I think. Let Kathleen,
Yeah, I wanted to
We can't stand there, you gotta come in.
Melissa, are there any questions in the chat? Or anyone who would like to, on Zoom, ask a question directly?
There are no questions right now, but hopefully they'll come.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Good evening, potential housing activists. That was a lot of information that we just heard, so you might want to all just take a deep breath before we go on to the next section. My name is Louise Enoch, and I was supposed to be up here to introduce Shayok Chakrabarty, who's an organizer with GBIO, which is the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. Unfortunately, Shayok was not able to make it, so I'm here to try to fill his shoes. I'll have to check with him later how successful I am. I am the Dorset Tzedek liaison to GBIO and have been involved with GBIO for several years. And why do we want you to know about GBIO if you don't already? Because this is the part of our program tonight where you can begin to think about how you can get involved to work for better, fair, and affordable housing for everyone. So let me tell you a bit about GBIO and the work it has been doing and will be doing to bring some changes to the housing scene locally and across the state. For those of you who don't know GBIO, and I'm sorry that those of you who do will have to listen to this piece, but it's important. GBIO is a nonpartisan interfaith community now made up of over 60 religious and other membership organizations. And by the way, many of the congregations that are members of GBIO live in the areas that were just described as having been redlined, and so they are, GBIO is a very diverse organization, both racially, ethnically, class-wise. GBIO is able to bring about change by organizing power. That power comes from its over 107,000 individual members. These members, when organized, can bring their power to bear on those who are in positions to make the changes that directly affect people's lives. GBIO is successful because it builds relationships and holds people accountable. GBIO brings people like you and me out to what it calls actions that confront decision makers with specific asks. Along the way, GBIO meets with these decision makers behind the scenes. It brings out its membership to make phone calls or to meet with local elected officials. It builds local leadership. And just want to say that in these communities that were being described, you can imagine that people have felt powerless. And so an organization like GBIO, which is committed to empowering people, that is why it is so appealing in these neighborhoods and in these religious communities. And of course, it brings a moral power with it, the interfaith community. The issues that GBIO decides to work on emerge from listening sessions, this year on Zoom, of course, which were held across GBIO's entire diverse community. In other words, GBIO's focus in each of its organizing cycles come directly from its membership. The three areas that were recently identified as problems for GBIO communities were re-entry from incarceration, mental health, and housing. So in the fall, when GBIO brought out about 900 people to meet with the mayoral candidates and the city council candidates, We asked, and they listened. They knew that GBIO could influence election outcomes. And so when they were asked to commit to certain things, like $50 million to rehabilitate the Mildred C. Haley public housing project in Jamaica Plain, they understood that if they said yes and were elected, they would be held accountable. And yes, since then candidate Wu had pledged that money, one of her first actions as mayor was to release those funds to that project. $50 million are going to improve the lives of people living in unsafe and unhealthy living conditions. GBIO got it done. So what lies ahead for GBIO, and where can you fit in to help carry out this work? Currently, GBIO is developing relationships and doing its research. It is considering 3 potential areas on which to craft its housing campaign so that it can accomplish its goals and have the greatest impact. Melissa, if you want to show my slides, please. Let me very briefly describe these areas as they are key to any housing advocacy work. The next slide, please. May I have the next slide? So I'm going to just very briefly describe these. I'm just learning about them myself and understanding them. They're much more complicated, but I'm going to give you a very simple, clear explanation. First of all, there's ARPA funds. The American Rescue Plan Act, which was for COVID relief, has provided federal money to states and local municipalities to use as they see fit. In Boston, $200 million are potentially available to help people with home ownership and affordable rental units. And I believe the $50 million that went to the Mildred C. Haley came from ARPA money. The second issue, please, is called real estate transfer fees. These are fees imposed upon the sale of real estate above a certain value, which could potentially generate substantial money annually for affordable housing. A state law currently in committee is necessary to enable local municipalities to adopt these kinds of fees. And the third area is the MBTA community zoning law. This new law requires 175 MBTA communities to create new zoning districts in which multifamily housing is permitted. Towns with MBTA subway or bus service must create these new zoning districts by 12/23. This law, used in conjunction with inclusionary zoning ordinances, would require that a percentage of these units be affordable. And I know this is a major issue that's going on in Newton, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it. GBIO will study ways to enact or move forward these efforts, putting the power of its members behind it. There are potentially several ways to influence efforts at the local and state levels by getting involved with statewide legislation, the gubernatorial race, or local campaigns. Current members of the GBIO Housing Steering Team are considering the way forward. Another team, called the Action Team, will be the place where individual members from the GBIO interfaith community, like some of you here tonight, can get involved in the work by helping to keep our congregations up to date on what's happening, helping with turnout for actions, and planning meetings with elected officials when needed. If you belong to a GBIO member or institution and want to get involved, speak to your GBIO liaison within your congregation. If you're not in a GBIO member organization but live in Newton, you are about to hear what some other activists in Newton are up to. Whatever community you live in, consider finding out about your local housing issues. Every town has them. And get involved. I'll end by letting you know that GBIO will be holding a large-scale action on May 26th The details about this are still being planned, but please mark your calendars and save the date. There's also a flyer on your table from the West Metro Housing Home Consortium. They're having a program on April 26th, is that it? So please look into that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Louise. It's my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Hobson, with whom I've begun to work and take action at the Newton Housing Coalition, Interfaith Housing Coalition. Kathleen is a member of the Union Church in Waban. She's lived in Newton since 1993 and raised her 3 children here, all of whom are in their mid-20s. In 2013, she helped found Engine 6, a volunteer group that advocates for fair, affordable, and abundant housing in Newton. The group originally formed to support an ill-fated proposal to convert the defunct firehouse in her neighborhood into homes for formerly homeless people. Kathleen recently joined the board of Metro West Collaborative Development, which co-authored the Engine 6 proposal with Pine Street Inn, and has served on the Gateway Arts Advisory Committee since 2019. She's also a tour guide at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and Congregation Dorshite Tzedek for inviting me as a representative of the new Newton Interfaith Housing Coalition to speak this evening. Fair housing is our fondest hope. So 3 years ago, a group of us from Union Church in Waban returned from a city mission pilgrimage to Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, fired up to start being the change we were seeking. And to help each other and our congregation get there, we formed a group called Advocates for Racial Justice. As we studied and learned together, watching movies like 13th and reading books like The Color of Law and Caste and The Sum of Us, and learning about the Newton versions of the racially discriminatory policies that the film discussed, like the destruction of the Myrtle Baptist Church community when the Pike came through, and Oak Hill Park, which was a VA development that blacks were excluded from. It didn't take long to realize that housing was everything, that your home, where you live, determines your education, your health, your access, your opportunities, your right to vote, your physical safety, your future, everything. And so we began thinking about where we live and how we got here and who we see and don't see in our neighborhoods, and the part that Newton plays in a region that is as racially and economically segregated as it ever was now, 54 years after the Fair Housing Act was passed. We also remember the fate of the Engine 6 proposal back in 2013, which would have enabled 9 formerly homeless adults to become our neighbors and reside safely and comfortably just down the road from the church in a refurbished old firehouse in Waban. Our congregation had actively supported this small housing proposal, but the politics were brutal and the proposal died. The much bigger change we were now seeking, broad progress toward fair housing as a means toward racial justice, toward Newton's being a place where anyone who chooses to live here can find a safe, suitable home within their economic means would take a much bigger and more sustained effort, and so we convened the first meeting of congregations from across Newton, and the Newton Interfaith Housing Coalition was born. The coalition is still very young and very much a work in progress, and we hope it will continue to grow and morph, but we do have that mission, inspired by our faith and the imperative to do justice, love our neighbor, and invite the stranger, to push for change that will make Newton a truly inclusive and welcoming community. And this will naturally require an abundant supply of smaller, accessible, more affordable, mostly multifamily homes. And we understand that for this to happen, we need to change the system. That is our zoning ordinance, the rules governing what and where we build. For over 70 years now, on the vast majority of residentially zoned land, only the most expensive kinds of homes can be built. Detached, relatively large, single-family houses. Guess what the median sales price of a single-family house is today? The Newton Interfaith Housing Coalition supports taking full advantage of two major opportunities before the city right now. Newton's own zoning redesign effort, which would include rezoning around village centers to allow for more homes, and the state's new multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA communities, which we see as a very happy coincidence. And tonight, we have recently sent a letter to the Newton City Council announcing our formation and explaining our priorities. And we look forward to meeting with councilors individually to speak about our housing hopes. Tonight, we have a call to action of sorts for all of you. Please educate yourselves about fair housing, about Newton's housing landscape, about the obstacles and opportunities we face as a community. We've put together some resources to get people started, and we can share those after the event. Henry alluded to a story I was going to tell about Newton, which I won't do now, but that story and several other distinct Newton stories that help paint the larger picture of us over the last century are in a document that I put together last year called Newton and Fair Housing, and that's one of the things that we'll share later. Also, stay tuned for, we are planning a teach-in in the fall, an interfaith teach-in in the fall. So hopefully, yeah, we'll be planning that, and you'll be hearing about that as details become available. But don't stop at education. Engine 6, as you now already know, are the Newton Housing Advocates, and we've been steadily pushing for fair housing change since 2013. I say we because I'm part of both organizations now. So start following the proceedings of the Zoning and Planning Committee of the Newton City Council, which meets 2 Mondays a night. Get to know your counselors and where they stand on zoning redesign and the MBTA communities law. Make them know where you stand and that you're following the issue closely and watching. Thank you.
Thank you, really, to everyone, and all the hard work that's been done over the years with regard to fair housing.